Welcome to Andre's Insight, where clarity meets curiosity. We've got quite a stack of sources in front of us today,
We certainly do.
and we're diving deep into something that, well, it shakes almost every interaction we have,
Oh,
negotiation.
exactly. And we're not just talking about the usual tactics, the stuff you read in basic business books.
Right.
These sources, it's a mix of research papers, transcripts from experts.
Yeah.
They really push us to look beneath the surface.
Into the psychology of it all.
Yeah, the deep psychological currents, those subtle biases, and the powerful emotional dynamics that are always swirling around.
Okay, so our mission here then is to unpack all of this. Pull out the key insights, the nuggets of knowledge that can actually help you listening navigate negotiations better.
Understand yourself, understand others more effectively, too.
And hopefully gain a new, maybe more insightful perspective on these really crucial moments. Okay, let's unpack this then. What do these sources tell us about the hidden forces kind of steering our deals, our disagreements?
Well, one of the first things that jumps out, a really fundamental idea, is that good negotiation isn't just about, stubbornly sticking to your position
Okay, position versus...
versus understanding the underlying interests. Positions are what you've decided on. Interests are why you decided that in the first place.
Can you give an example? How does that play out?
Sure. These sources bring up a classic, really powerful, real-world case. The Egyptian-Israeli peace talks over the Sinai Peninsula.
Ah, okay. I vaguely remember that. What was the issue?
Well, Israel's position was straightforward. We need to keep some of this land for security. Egypt's position was equally firm. No, we need all the land back. It's our sovereign territory.
Like, so completely incompatible positions, right? Like head to head.
Exactly, like two kids wanting the very same toy. You can't both have it entirely.
So how on earth did they break that deadlock?
They shifted the focus. They moved from the fixed positions to the core interests. Israel's deeper interest wasn't necessarily owning that specific patch of desert. It was security, meaning not having enemy tanks parked right on their border. Egypt's core interest was sovereignty, reclaiming land that was historically, undeniably theirs.
Okay, so security versus sovereignty, different underlying needs.
Precisely. And once they understood those deeper whys, they could get creative. They came up with a solution that met both needs.
What was it?
Egypt got full sovereignty over all of the Sinai, fulfilling their core interest. But Israel got demilitarized zones, buffer zones, international monitors within the Sinai, fulfilling their security interest.
Ah, so it wasn't about compromising on the position, like splitting the land down the middle.
Not at all. It was about finding a new way, a creative solution to satisfy those fundamental needs.
That's a fantastic illustration. So, okay, interests are key. But how do you figure them out, especially the other side's interests, which they might not want to reveal?
The sources suggest a pretty simple, powerful technique. Just ask why.
Ask them directly. Or just ask yourself.
Both, really. Look at the decision they seem to be making or the stance they're taking and ask yourself, why haven't they agreed to what I want? What are their underlying worries, their motivations, their constraints? And just as importantly, when you're making your case, the research suggests you should lead with your why. Give your interests and your reasoning first.
Before you make your proposal.
Exactly. Explain why you need what you're asking for. Then state your conclusion or proposal. People are apparently much more willing to listen, to engage, if they understand your perspective before they hear your demand.
That makes a lot of sense. It feels less confrontational. Okay, that's a great practical tip. Now, speaking of preparation, the sources also really hammer home the importance of knowing your BTNA.
Yes, the BTNA. Your best alternative to a negotiated agreement.
Right. What exactly is that again?
It's basically your plan B. What result can you get without reaching a deal with this specific person or party? It's what you'll do if you walk away.
So, it's your walkaway point.
It defines your walkaway point. An agreement only makes sense if it's better than your BATNA. If what they're offering is worse than what you can get on your own, you walk.
Is that the same thing as setting a bottom line? People talk about that a lot.
The sources make a distinction, and it's actually quite important. A bottom line is often just, well, an arbitrary figure you fix in your head beforehand. I won't pay a penny over X, or I won't accept less than Y.
And that's bad.
It can be. Well, it stops you from accepting a truly terrible deal. It can also make you really rigid. It might blind you to creative solutions that look different from what you expected, but are still way better than your BTNA.
Oh, I see. So the BTNA is based on your real-world alternatives, whereas the bottom line might just be something you decided.
Exactly. Your BTNA is a much better, more objective measure for evaluating any potential agreement.
Got it. BTNA good, rigid bottom line. Maybe less so. Did the sources mention other core principles? I think you mentioned separating people from the problem.
Yes, that's a key one from principled negotiation. Also, things like uh, generating lots of options before you start judging them or deciding, and try and use objective criteria, market value, scientific judgment, professional standards whenever you can.
Big sense.
But underlying all these techniques, the sources really stress, you have to deal with the people involved as human beings with respect,
Yeah.
recognizing they have emotions, needs, perspectives.
If you ignore the human element.
You could sink the whole thing, yeah, no matter how clever your strategy is.
Okay, so we've got the strategic foundation, interests, BATNA, treating people well. But then things get, well, messy, right? The psychology comes in.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the sources show just how much our own minds can, work against us.
Yeah.
Or for us, often completely unconsciously.
Biases and things.
Cognitive biases, exactly. We're all prone to them, especially under pressure, like in a negotiation.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest ones discussed is the anchoring effect.
Right, that's where the first piece of information you hear just sticks in your head and influences everything else, even if it's totally random.
Precisely. The sources mention research, like a study looking at how consumers judge prices. They found people were significantly swayed by random anchor numbers when guessing how much products should cost.
Wow. Did it affect everyone equally in that study, or were some people more easily anchored?
It varied. The study found that under certain conditions, things like gender, personality type, how much knowledge someone already had, and their skill level made a difference in how strongly they were anchored.
Okay.
But interestingly, at least in that specific consumer context, things like being under time pressure or how self-confident the person felt didn't seem to significantly change the anchoring effect.
Huh. That is surprising about time pressure. I'd have thought that would make it worse. So how does this anchoring play out in a real negotiation?
Oh, it's huge. Absolutely huge. Think about the first offer made. Whether it's the seller's asking price or the buyer's opening bid, that number acts as a really powerful anchor.
It sets the starting point.
It sets the starting point, it frames the entire negotiation range, and it heavily influences all the counteroffers and where you eventually land. Research even shows it affects how satisfied negotiators feel with the final outcome.
Even if the outcome is objectively good.
Yeah. And it can even bias how you estimate the other person's secret walkaway price, their reservation point. So a biased start can really drag the whole negotiation off course.
Wow. So making that first offer, even if it feels a bit bold, can really shape the game. What other biases should we be aware of?
Well, there are framing effects. This is all about how the way information is presented, the frame around it, totally changes how we react.
Like saying 90% fat-free versus 10% fat.
Exactly like that. The sources mention how framing impacts things like social dilemmas. Just describing the same situation with different words can make people assume different things about the game or what the other players might do. Framing something as a potential gain versus a potential loss triggers very different responses.
Okay. And are there biases tied to our own wants and needs?
Yep. Motivational biases. These are different from just like misreading social cues. They come from our own goals, our desires. They can unconsciously twist how we see information so it fits what we want to believe is true.
Which sounds like it could lead straight to overconfidence.
Bingo. The sources talk a lot about overconfidence in negotiators. It's this common tendency to overestimate the odds that your offer will be accepted, or maybe that a judge or arbitrator would rule in your favor if it came to that.
And that's bad because...
Because, according to the research, negotiators who are overconfident tend to be less willing to compromise, less concessionary. And maybe counterintuitively, that rigidity often leads to worse outcomes.
How so?
They might push too hard and cause an impasse, missing a deal entirely. Or they might overlook opportunities for creative, mutually beneficial trade-offs because they're so sure their initial stance is the only right one.
So thinking you've got it in the bag can actually lead to you getting nothing. That's
Yeah.
sobering.
Okay.
Strategy biases. Now let's get into the really human stuff the sources covered. Emotion.
Yeah, emotion gets a lot of attention. And the sources make this really critical distinction up front.
Yeah.
The difference between the emotions you actually feel, the ones you experience internally,
Okay.
and the emotions you show, the ones you express outwardly. They aren't always the same thing.
Right. So how do those two sides, feeling versus showing, impact a negotiation? Let's start with feeling.
Okay, so the research on experienced emotion, what you're actually feeling, it consistently shows that positive emotions, like feeling happy or optimistic, are generally good for negotiation.
How?
Well, people feeling positive tend to be less argumentative, more creative in finding solutions. They explore more alternatives, make more trade-offs, and generally reach better, more integrative outcomes. Joint gains tend to go up.
Makes sense. And negative emotions, anger, frustration.
Usually detrimental. Experiencing anger in particular is often linked to worse results. Angry negotiators tend to achieve fewer joint gains, they can get locked into conflict spirals, and sometimes they even reject offers that are objectively economically good for them, just out of spite or principle.
Irrational decisions driven by feeling bad.
Okay, so feeling good helps, feeling bad hurts.
Yeah.
Pretty clear. But what about expressing emotion? If I feel angry, should I show it? Does that help or hurt?
That's where it gets really interesting and where this ESI model comes in.
Is.
Yeah, ES, it stands for Emotions as Social Information. The idea is that your emotional expressions act as signals to the other person. They influence the other person's behavior, not just by making them feel the same emotion that's contagion, but by triggering inferences they make about you based on your expression.
Okay, ESI, emotions as social information. So if
Yep.
I express anger, what kind of information, what signal does that send according to this model?
Well, the research shows pretty clearly that expressing anger makes you look tough, demanding.
Okay, perceived toughness.
Right. One study mentioned in the sources found that while expressing anger didn't necessarily help negotiators create more value, like make the overall pie bigger in a complex deal.
Uh-huh.
The angry expressors did manage to claim a bigger slice of that pie for themselves compared to people who expressed neutral emotions. So they got more.
They claim more value, yes. Especially, the study noted, when their counterpart perceived they didn't have very good alternatives when their BTNA was weak. The inference might be, wow, this person is really dug in and tough. I guess I need to give in more.
So showing anger can potentially help you grab more for yourself. That sounds kind of useful, if a bit aggressive.
It sounds tempting, doesn't it? But and this is a huge, but highlighted in the sources, there's a major downside.
It is.
Interacting with someone who's expressing anger makes the other person significantly more likely to just walk away, to abandon the negotiation entirely. Impasse rates go way up.
Why? What's the inference there?
The inference seems to be that the angry person is selfish, unreasonable, maybe even hostile. People think, I can't work with this person, and they just bail.
So you might win the battle for that extra slice, but you lose the war because the whole deal collapses.
Exactly. It's that risk of burning the whole bakery down, like we discussed before. Now, the sources do suggest this walk-away effect might lessen a bit over time if the negotiation continues for a while.
Okay.
But that initial impact, that risk of immediate impasse when you show anger,
Yeah.
it's very real and very significant.
Got it. High risk, maybe high reward in claiming value, but potentially catastrophic. What about other emotional factors?
Well, there's emotional contagion, too. Emotions can be literally contagious. If the other person expresses anger, you might start feeling angry or agitated yourself, even if you weren't initially.
Oh yeah, I've definitely felt that happen. Things escalate quickly.
They really can. It pulls you out of rational thinking and into just reacting emotionally.
This all sounds like a total minefield. How do skilled negotiators handle all this emotional stuff?
It's a key skill, and the sources talk about developing emotion management expertise. It's multifaceted. It involves, first, just being aware of your own emotions. What are you feeling? How intense is it? Then, being able to accurately read or gauge the emotions of the other party.
So emotional intelligence, basically.
A big part of it, yes. But it's also about understanding how your own emotional displays, what you choose to show, might be read, might be interpreted by the other side, like we just discussed with anger.
Okay.
And skilled negotiators might even use strategic emotional displays. The sources mention distinguishing between deep acting, where you genuinely feel the emotion you're showing, and surface acting, where you're essentially putting on an emotional mask you don't actually feel.
Faking it.
Well, perhaps strategically managing the display is a better way to put it. It's a complex skill, and one that can apparently be learned and honed.
Managing your display.
Yeah.
That leads us right into another really tricky area the sources cover. Deception.
Yeah, they don't pull any punches. The sources describe negotiation as potentially a breeding ground for deception.
Why is that? The pressure. The stakes.
All of that. And they define deception quite broadly. Intentionally misrepresenting information or emotions.
So lying about your bottom line, counts, obviously. But lying about how you feel also counts as deception in this context.
According to these sources, yes, misrepresenting your feelings, like pretending to be angry when you're not, or pretending to be happy with an offer when you're actually disappointed, that falls under emotional deception.
Okay. And does it matter why you're being deceptive?
It seems to. They
Yep.
differentiate
What?
between self-interested deception, misleading the other person purely for your own gain,
Right.
and maybe pro-social deception, like a white lie told to maybe save face or avoid hurting someone's feelings, though that's less the focus in hard bargaining. Self-interested deception, though, is generally seen very negatively if you get caught.
Trust is destroyed.
Completely.
Right.
It can wreck the negotiation, damage the relationship long-term, and might even lead the other side to actively avoid you or punish you later if they can. And even misrepresenting your emotions, that emotional deception, can hurt your performance.
Interesting. Is there a link between being overconfident and being deceptive?
There is, actually. The research mentioned connects high negotiator self-efficacy, basically,
Hmm.
really believing you're a great negotiator, with a higher likelihood of using that self-interested deception.
Why would that be?
The thinking seems to be driven by a lower perceived risk of getting caught. If you're convinced you're super skilled, you might think, hey, I can pull this off, I can lie, and they'll never know.
Wow. So confidence can potentially lead down a dark path there. Fascinating how all these psychological bits, biases, emotions, confidence, deception, they all weave together, don't they?
They absolutely do. It's not just one factor working in isolation, it's a complex interplay.
And the sources don't stop there. They also zoom out and put all of this into a wider context, right? Like culture.
Exactly. That's a crucial layer. A lot of the early foundational research on negotiation was done primarily in Western cultures, often North America. But these sources really emphasize culture matters a lot.
How does culture actually shape negotiation dynamics?
Oh, in so many ways. It influences the social context, the background assumptions people bring, their communication styles, what's considered normal or acceptable behavior.
Like being direct versus indirect.
That's a big one. Cultural differences pop up everywhere. Negotiation strategies influence tactics. Some cultures might favor very direct, logical arguments. Others might rely more on relationship building, appeals to emotion, or more indirect communication. The sources contrast approaches you might see in places like the US versus Russia or Japan versus China.
So trying to use a one-size-fits-all negotiation script across cultures is probably a bad idea.
A very bad idea, yes.
Yeah.
Culture can also change how other factors work, like how much power distance is accepted, how gender roles play out, even how people use different communication methods, like email versus face-to-face.
Can you give an example of a major cultural dimension?
Sure, the classic one is individualism versus collectivism. In highly individualistic cultures, like the US often is, the focus tends to be on self-interest, individual achievement, directness. In more collectivistic cultures, the focus might be more on group harmony, maintaining relationships. Think of the Chinese concept of guangxi, those important social networks, and maybe using more indirect communication to help everyone save face.
And these deep values influence how people negotiate.
Absolutely. They shape strategic choices, how people process information, what they prioritize in a deal. Is it just the economic outcome, or is the relationship equally or even more important?
Does this extend to how conflicts get resolved too? Different cultural preferences there?
Definitely. The sources point out that different cultures might prefer different ways for third parties, like mediators or arbitrators, to step in. Maybe relying on someone with high status and authority in Japan, or sticking strictly to rules and regulations in Germany, or focusing on uncovering those underlying interests in the US.
Culture can even cause the conflict itself.
Sometimes, yes. When core cultural values clash, that can be the root cause of the disagreement. And even when you bring in a mediator, their own cultural background can subtly bias how they handle things.
What about fairness or justice? Does culture change what people think is fair?
Well, the concern for justice seems to be pretty universal. People everywhere care about being treated fairly. But what constitutes fairness, the substance of it, both in the outcome and the process, that can definitely vary across cultures.
Is there anything consistent across cultures regarding fairness?
One thing that seems really important almost everywhere for procedural fairness feeling the process was fair is whether you trust the third party involved. If the mediator or judge is seen as trustworthy, people are much more likely to accept the outcome, comply with it, and feel okay about the relationship going forward.
Makes sense. Trust is key. And you mentioned communication medium earlier, email versus face-to-face. That has an impact too.
A significant one. The medium affects our sense of social presence, how aware we are of the other person as a real human being.
So face-to-face is generally better.
It tends to promote more cooperation, maybe more politeness, because all those nonverbal cues are present. Text-only communication, like email, has much lower social presence. You lose the tone of voice, the facial expressions.
And that can lead to problems.
It can. People might be more blunt, more easily misunderstand intentions, maybe feel less inhibited about being aggressive. It can also reduce the awareness of social status differences sometimes. Things definitely get lost in translation more easily via text.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that email misunderstanding. Okay, shifting gears just a bit towards the end here. The sources also mentioned technology playing a role now, particularly in training.
Yes, that's an emerging area. Things like AI, machine learning,
Hmm.
they're being explored as tools to help teach negotiation skills.
How would that work?
Well, AI systems can analyze huge amounts of data from negotiation simulations or maybe even real ones, and then provide personalized feedback to learners.
Like having an AI negotiation coach.
Kind of, yeah. You might negotiate against a virtual agent, a computer program designed to simulate different negotiation styles.
Does it work?
The sources suggest it shows some promise. Personalized AI feedback seems pretty good at helping users learn how to claim more value, get a bigger slice of the pie for themselves in simulations.
But there sounds like a but coming.
The but is that teaching people how to create more value, how to work together to make the pie bigger for everyone, that seems to be harder to do effectively with AI coaching, at least so far.
Interesting limitation. So it might be better at teaching competitive tactics than collaborative ones right now. Did technology link back to the emotion stuff at all?
It did. There was discussion about using technology, maybe through structured learning platforms or simulations with feedback, to help people build that emotion management expertise we talked about.
Bridging the gap between knowing you should manage emotions and actually doing it.
Exactly. Helping negotiators understand the strategic ins and outs of different emotions, the risks, the potential benefits, and maybe even practice using those strategic emotional displays more effectively in a safe environment before they try it in a real high-stakes situation.
This has been incredibly rich. It really paints a picture of negotiation as so much more than just, haggling over price or terms.
Absolutely.
Mm.
What these sources collectively show is that negotiation is this incredibly complex tapestry. It's woven together from threads of strategy, yes, but also deep psychological biases, the undeniable power of emotion, and all these layers of context, culture, communication channels.
And understanding all those underlying forces isn't just like academic navel-gazing.
Not at all. It's deeply practical. Knowing this stuff can fundamentally change how you prepare, how you interact, and the outcomes you achieve.
So for you listening, how can you start applying some of this? It feels like a lot to keep in mind.
Maybe just start by being more aware.
Yeah.
Next time you find yourself in any kind of negotiation, big or small, try to notice the potential biases. Are you getting anchored by the first number thrown out? Is the way something's being framed influencing your choices or theirs?
And pay attention to the emotional temperature, maybe.
Definitely. What are you feeling? What are you actually showing? And crucially, how might the way you're expressing your emotions, especially something potent like anger, be landing on the other person? Remember that risk of driving them to walk away.
Also consider the context, right? Are there cultural differences you need to account for? Is email the best way to have this conversation, or would face-to-face be better?
Right. And framing all this knowledge, it's not just about becoming a better negotiator in the sense of winning more often. It's about smarter preparation, more insightful conversations, maybe finding wiser, more sustainable solutions.
And hopefully building better relationships in the process, even when you disagree.
Exactly. Because you understand the human dynamics better.
This deep dive really drives home that negotiation is this intricate human dance. Knowing the steps, the tactics is important, sure.
But understanding the music.
Yeah, understanding the music, the psychology, the emotion, the context, that seems just as crucial, maybe even more so.
And what's really fascinating here is, if you connect all these dots, it really raises a big question about self-awareness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How well do we actually understand our own triggers, our own biases, our own emotional tendencies in these moments?
That's a great point. So here's a final thought for you to maybe mull over. Consider how actively recognizing these psychological patterns, these emotional currents, not just spotting them in other people, but really noticing them within yourself. How might that change things?
Not just how you approach a formal salary negotiation or buying a car.
Right, but how you perceive and navigate all sorts of everyday interactions, disagreements with partners, kids, colleagues, conflicts big and small. Something to think about until the next time.
Indeed. Lots to chew on there.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.